The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, everything Donald Trump gets wrong about the Great Wall of China, plus everything progressive Democrats get right about Social Security expansion. And Bill Press talks with Oregon Representative Earl Blumenauer about why he refused to show up for the State of the Union. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. President Trump often cites the Great Wall of China as evidence that a wall will solve our immigration problems. Our first guest says it's a claim that history cannot support. And we say hello to Adam Smith, professor of anthropology at Cornell University, where he studies the relationship of the physical worlds we build to our political lives and values. Adam Smith, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You wrote a piece for the Washington Post a few years back that has been getting renewed attention. It was titled, "For 5 Millennia, Politicians Have Proposed Walls Like Trump's. They Don't Work." So with such a bad track record, what drives leaders to construct walls?
Well, I think it's because walls are a remarkably, deceptively perfect, simple solution. They appear to be a straightforward piece of architecture, but in fact, they're really complex technologies. And it's that dislocation between the image of them as simple and how they actually work that is part of their attraction. And I think one of the things we need to constantly keep in mind, as with any technology, we need to ask not just do they work, but rather ask work for what and for whom. I mean, we can, like archaeologists often do, we can look at other kinds of technologies as parallels and see if we can find answers to that question. So oftentimes people will ask about the wheel, for example, another piece of technology, and the wheel works really well if you want to get from, say, New York to Washington, D.C. or something like that. But, of course, if A and B, or if your places are separated by an ocean, if New York to Paris is where you want to go, wheels don't work at all. So the question is, you always have to keep in mind, is work for what? I think we also have to keep in mind the question of, are there other technologies available that might work better? So archaeologists often study things like stone tools, for example, which were remarkably able during the Neolithic to clear huge forests, making way for some of humanity's earliest farmers. But if you really wanted to make a farm today, yes, a stone tool would work. But is there something else that would work that would be less laborious and less expensive and perhaps less time-consuming as well? So I think to simply say, do walls work, or as President Trump often likes to say, walls work, is really a deceptively simplistic way of looking at what is actually a complex technology.
Mm-hmm. Now, Adam, the president often cites the Great Wall of China as an example of success. Mm-hmm. What is he missing?
Well, I think what he's missing is that the Great Wall of China is actually not one wall, first of all. It's actually many different kinds of linear barriers that were set up over the course of over 300 years. And so what he's missing is that these are actually a broad system of sets of relationships between what's inside and outside that was in development for hundreds of years. And I think what he's also missing is that walls, or better you said, linear barriers, because that's what he's really talking about, are not only about blocking transportation. It's also about funneling. And linear barriers tend to work much better at funneling traffic than they do at completely forbidding connectivity. So whether it's Hadrian's Wall or the Great Wall of China, those walls tended to work really well as pushing peoples together at specific gate points. So the whole idea of many of these walls was to actually create specific gateways where then there would be interaction across these gateways, which was particularly ideal for the state or government because then you can tax them. Whereas if the interactions are spread out across villages, across thousands of miles, taxation is much more difficult. So a linear barrier can work really well for regulating interconnections, particularly for the purposes of taxation. What it doesn't work for is long-term forestalling of large-scale migrations. And that's what Trump is missing about the Great Wall of China.
We're speaking with Adam Smith, professor of anthropology at Cornell University, where he studies the relationship of the physical worlds we build to our political lives and values. And Adam, if walls do not succeed in their stated goals, such as limiting migration, they do live on as political symbols. And you cite the Berlin Wall as an example. What's the symbolism of that wall?
Well, the symbolism for people in the U.S. for a generation was that the Berlin Wall was a means of trapping the citizens of what was then the Warsaw Pact behind a system of repression. And so walls really got that sense that they were walls of imprisonment rather than walls of protection. I think that that's a key element of the way in which the debate over walls is going on now, and that the lingering significance of the Berlin Wall as a means of trapping citizens rather than of protecting them is really something that we're still working through today. And it's clear that the president doesn't really quite understand the symbolism behind the wall as both something that can forestall migration across it, but also feels like it's cutting off interaction and imprisoning the people within it.
And isolating us in the meantime from the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Both symbolically as a nation that is fearful and resentful of the world, and also physically in terms of trade and interaction.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you listen to the president talk about the wall he wants to build on our southern border, what's the symbolism and meaning you hear him speaking to?
Well, I think it's actually a relatively old sense of fear that we mostly hear. And you often hear him bring up the parallel between, say, your fence around your house or the wall around a city as parallel to the kinds of linear barrier he has in mind across something like 2,000 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. But those are actually drawn out of very different kinds of symbolic systems. So the fence around your house is obviously not intended as a guard against massive migrations of your neighbors into your yard. It's a completely different kind of symbolic system that's more about home and the continuity of property. The city wall is much more emblematic symbolically in history of the kind of independence of a city. In ancient Mesopotamia, when a city would build a wall, it was a very clear demonstration of their own sovereignty. And then concomitantly, when a city was conquered, one of the first things that the conquering force would do would be to knock down some of the city walls to show your subservience. And there, the city wall was really symbolic of one's independence rather than it was functional in a military sense, and particularly in ancient Mesopotamia at least. When we're talking about long linear barriers that stretch off way into places that are largely uninhabited, you really lose a lot of that symbolic potency because most of the time they're not encountered and most people don't even know they're there. I think it wouldn't be untrue to suggest that many Americans don't know exactly what the wall that's already along portions of the southern border actually looks like. So I think one of the difficulties of thinking about the symbolism of a long linear barrier is that so much of what's planned would be really invisible to most citizens.
Mm-hmm. What are the unintended consequences of wall building that you would want to warn us about?
Well, there are probably many unintended consequences. I mean, one of them is that walls tend to move population movements into different places. They don't block them, they just move them. And so a lot of the walls that have been built along the U.S.-Mexico border, like walls that were built in ancient Mesopotamia as well, have not stopped the movement. They've merely put it in different places. And so a number of anthropologists have pointed out the humanitarian crisis that occurred when a number of walls were built that merely forced migrants out into harsher conditions of the deserts of the U.S. Southwest. This was, of course, what I would think of as an unintended consequence, where a goal of forestalling migration actually merely had the impact of making it far, far more dangerous and costing more in human life. So that's one of the major impacts. The other is that walls have a long set of obligations that they entail. So it's not enough just to say, well, I want $5 billion or more likely $25 billion to build a wall. You then have to keep them up. And one of the lessons of, for example, the Great Wall of China is that it's extremely expensive to keep and maintain walls, that they are in constant need of repair and constant need of provisioning and constant need of manning. And as such, you also tend to make your responses to any kinds of activities at the border become more rigid and less supple. So you build, say, guard stations along the border. Now you've got places that need to be manned, need to be occupied, and you create a much less mobile force that's actually supervising movement across that border. All of these are the kinds of unintended consequences that are entailed because the wall creates certain possibilities for policing while getting rid of others.
Well, I have a feeling this is not the last time we're going to have a conversation about a wall, and we would love to have you back and join us to talk more about it. Adam Smith, professor of anthropology at Cornell University, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Adam, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. You as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why entitlement is a four-letter word. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
A newspaper photograph last June portrayed three guys in suits and ties shoveling dirt. They were Donald Trump, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, and the chairman of Foxconn, the Taiwanese electronics conglomerate. They were doing a PR groundbreaking for Foxconn's new plant that supposedly would hire thousands of blue-collar workers in Wisconsin to make flat-screen televisions. All three hailed the event as the start of a made-in-the-USA manufacturing renaissance. But it was actually a corporate scam. Walker, who was up for re-election, was giving away a whopping $4 billion from his state's taxpayers to lure Foxconn. Still, Trump hailed the deal as the eighth wonder of the world. Less than a year later, though, oops, it turns out the three had been shoveling BS. In January, Foxconn quietly backed away from its promise of all those factory jobs, declaring that, quote, the global market environment has changed. In terms of TV, we have no place in the U.S. Having already pocketed much of Walker's bribe money, Foxconn was downsizing its project from a mass-production blue-collar factory to some sort of high-tech R&D operation. It turns out that the Taiwanese giant has a history of reneging on its grandiose schemes, including failing to deliver on a Pennsylvania factory it promised in 2013. Still, Foxconn is right that the environment had changed. Walker was defeated in November. Wisconsinites are in an uproar over both his extravagant giveaway and the corporation's backaway. The new Democratic governor is asking pointed questions, and Trump's slap-happy zigzags on tariffs has roiled the whole high-tech market. This is Jim Hightower saying, so beware. When you see a picture of politicians shoveling the people's tax dollars into corporate coffers, the only sure thing is that the people are being played for suckers.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Progressive Democrats in Congress are lining up to back the first big expansion to Social Security since the 1970s. Our next guest says it's a fight that couldn't come at a better time. And we're speaking with Eric Kingson, professor of social work at Syracuse University. He is co-founder and chairman of the board of Social Security Works and co-chairs the Strengthened Social Security Campaign. And along with Nancy Altman, he co-authored the book Social Security Works, Why Social Security Isn't Going Broke and How Expanding It Will Help Us All. Eric, why is this such an important issue right now in terms of the American safety net?
Well, Social Security, again, as I mentioned, is there because it does some things we can't do by ourselves, and it's worked very well, even in recessions when 401ks are going down the tubes in some cases, or contributions are being reduced and American workers are losing their savings, sometimes jobs. The system provided benefits each and every year, each and every month. No one lost benefits or had to worry about benefits. What's important is that we're living in a time where economic insecurity is increasing for American working persons, and where the retirement income security of American working persons is not as strong as it was a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it becomes very important to be thinking about expanding the system and to move away from this incorrect discussion that was taking place really going back 10 years. The discussion was about whether to cut Social Security and how much to cut it. I think, and this was even Democrats were going along and saying, well, I guess we have to have some modest cuts. A few Democrats like Bernie Sanders, Keith Ellison were saying don't cut. The discussion has really shifted where 205 Democrats in the House of Representatives and 19 senators, all of them Democrats, unfortunately. It would be good if there were some Republicans. But all of them are saying, let's talk about expanding the system. They've signed on to this bill. And that marks a historic moment in the development of the Social Security discussions we're having today. We've shifted away from advocacy of cutting the system. Doesn't mean what doesn't mean that some people won't be talking about cutting benefits by raising retirement age or privatizing, but it's clear that the Democratic Party isn't going to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Now, what type of fight would you expect to see on this? I mean, Republicans often target entitlement program as the reason for the growing deficit.
Yeah, and Republicans have also been successful in using pejorative language like entitlement. I talk about entitlement. The term entitlement is an 11-letter word that's been turned into a 4-letter word because people don't like entitlements. They love Social Security, they love Medicare, they love Medicaid. The purpose of using the term entitlement has been to diminish the importance of Social Security and these programs in the eyes of the public. So I think what's happening is that it's going to become radioactive in a few years to be talking about cutting Social Security. It's I think we're going to see momentum moving towards some kind of judicious expansions. This is fully affordable. We can expand benefits, and we can also make changes, which the Larson bill, H.R. 2100 and the Senate companion, the bill actually has changes in it which addresses the future shortfalls in Social Security. Social Security is never going to go broke. It's got the best estimates about Social Security is that we can pay all benefits through 2033. After that, we are 24 cents short, roughly, on every dollar the American people have earned. That's a problem, and we can address it. And the bill shows how it can be addressed in some very reasonable ways, and still have a little money left over for expansion.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the 11-letter word of entitlement being turned into a 4-letter word. What are some of the other myths about Social Security that are used to discredit it?
We don't get our money's worth out of the system. You'll hear people who want to pull apart the system say higher income people would do better in an IRA or something, and then at the same breath they're going to say low income people don't get enough. And we don't resolve Social Security, that it's unaffordable, it's going bust, that that certain groups don't benefit from it. And so it's talked about in a variety of negative ways, and it's reinforced, and it came into the common parlance for a number of years. The idea that the system was going to be overwhelmed by the aging of the baby boom became presented almost as fact, when in fact it wasn't true. And which doesn't mean we don't need to adjust the system at times. As I said, periodically we make adjustments. It's like the highway system. You get a few bumps in the road. You don't say, let's rip up the U.S. highway system and privatize it or reduce the protections of it. You basically fix it. Same for Social Security. You make adjustments.
I think the analogy for the highway system is perfect. I mean, you pave over the the potholes in the wintertime and that sort of thing to make it drivable and make it work. Now, Eric, in terms of larger politics, how does this issue help progressive Democrats position themselves with the public?
Well, I think this is the single most popular program or policy the federal government has. It also gives expression to some very core values, the idea that we have some obligations to our neighbors, to our family, to our parents, our children. We have a responsibility to work hard, but if we work hard, we also should have some benefits in return, protection in return, and that we're concerned about human dignity. All of this is part of the system, and I think it's commonly held by the American public. Blue, green, red, doesn't matter, independent, whatever. Americans like their Social Security. And when you give Americans a choice, they inevitably will, the vast majority will say, I'm willing to see some modest tax increases in order to avoid things like cutting the program through raising the retirement age or cutting cost of living adjustments. So I think it shifted the politics. I think Democrats in particular were moved themselves on defensive on Social Security. They ended up mirroring the kind of Republican talking points of we can't afford Social Security. We have to cut it. It's a cause of the deficit. Well, it isn't a cause of the deficit because Social Security cannot borrow a single penny from the federal government's general revenues. In fact, it loans the federal government money, which it then receives interest from. But by law, it can't do it. If revenues for the program fall short of what's needed for contributions, benefits would be reduced some. Obviously, no one wants to do that, and I don't think it'll happen. But the point is that we have a system we should be proud of. It is the core protection we provide to the American people, all of us together, that we provide ourselves. And Americans know that. And so if those who are interested in cutting or dramatically changing the program in some negative way, they like to do it behind closed doors. Because when you get into the light, the discussions come into the sunlight, it becomes very clear that what they're proposing is to cut the program. So I think the Democratic Party has taken itself out of the position of being a cautious supporter of the program, but willing to accept some benefit cuts, to very explicitly saying we will not accept cuts to the program, and we can address financing problems in judicious ways, and at the same time we can also modestly expand benefits. So I think it's a huge advantage to Democrats to be forthrightly for this system that aligns so well with American values and also bloody works so well.
Yeah, right. It works well, and people are buying into it, and they deserve it. Absolutely.
And it's theirs. It's an earned right.
Exactly.
One other thing, just on the financing, what the bill includes. The bill includes some important benefit adjustments. It would improve the cost of living measures so that benefits really would keep up with inflation the way it had originally been intended when that inflation adjustment was put into the law in 1972. It also provides a 2% across-the-board benefit increase, roughly, and it assures that anyone who's worked long and hard throughout their career will not retire with income below 125% of the poverty level. It also provides for a roughly 50-cent increase in payroll tax contributions each week for roughly 23 years. In other words, very gradually, over 23 years, the payroll contribution will increase from 6.2% today to 7.4%. It's basically giving up a cup of chock full of nuts. Some people would say Starbucks, but I stay away from that. But it's giving up 2 cups of chock full of nuts coffee, one cup of Starbucks coffee a week, only one the first year. In the year 2, you're giving up 2. So it's 50 cents year 1, $1 in year 2. It also says it's about time for millionaires and billionaires to pay the same contribution rate as everyone else, so that it would require earnings above $400,000 to make people who earn above $400,000 to make contributions on all that income above that. Today we stopped taking Social Security contributions at $132,700. That's $132,700. This would say we're going to, when you reach $400,000 in earnings, above that, you're going to make a contribution on all your earnings, just like everyone else, virtually everyone else. So those 2 things alone address the shortfall. They're not onerous. And when you give the American public a choice between doing something like that and simultaneously providing small benefit increases and not cutting the program at all, overwhelmingly the public finds that it favors that approach, and I think that's important. And I think it's an important message to Democrats. They're not going to go wrong broadly defending the concept of Social Security and defending its benefits and talking about protecting today's working people by expanding benefits. And frankly, I'd go further. I think we can go further. There are other things that can be done, including paid family leave, which should be part of our Social Security program.
Amen to that. Eric Kingson, professor of social work at Syracuse University. He is co-founder and chairman of the board of Social Security Works. With Nancy Altman, he is co-author of the book, Social Security Works, Why Social Security Isn't Going Broke and How Expanding It Will Help Us All. Eric, thank you so much for your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
It'd be a pleasure, and thank you for focusing attention on this issue and for all the work you do.
Oh, absolutely. We're all in this together.
We are.
All right.
I think I heard that before. Thanks a lot.
Okay. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer about the State of the Union address we should have heard.
We're lucky enough today to welcome from Oregon's 3rd Congressional District our good friend Congressman Earl Blumenauer. Congressman, great to see you.
Likewise, Bill. Good to see you.
Thank you for coming in. Representing one of the world's greatest cities, Portland, Oregon. I love it. And it keeps getting better and better. You know?
Well, we want you to stop by a little longer on your way to Central Oregon.
I know. I spend more time in Bend, Oregon these days because that's where we have a son and daughter-in-law and 2 wonderful grandsons. But you know, the former First Lady is going to be in Portland this weekend, Michelle Obama, for part of her book tour.
Yep.
Right? I'm sure.
A lot of excitement.
She'll have a huge crowd there.
Huge crowd. Lots of fans.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know.
Congressman, I have to ask if you've ever done a cameo on Portlandia, the TV show.
No, but my bike pins have.
Oh, nice.
Well, we've spent some time around the filming. But they stayed away from politicians, to their credit. Although they had they had a former Portland mayor who did cameos on there, a guy named Sam Adams.
Oh, really? Yeah.
But it was just great to watch him show up and watch the filming. It was really
when you go to a set like that, it's amazing how many people there are. You know, the gaffers and it's just.
But they take over.
It takes a village.
Yeah, but they take over an actual shop or a home.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, they were filming in a home down the street from where I live, and it is quite a production. Great people, and it gave a picture of what Portland really's like.
There you go. So before we jump into some more news of the day, we've been at it for about a half an hour, and we always give our listeners and viewers a chance to sound off. Congressman, here, Peter.
Yes, indeed. Lots of comments on Twitter, @BP Show. Lots of comments about the situation in Virginia this morning. Holly says, considering how problematic male candidates and politicians are, let's just elect women, especially women of color. That is an idea I could get behind. Phil says, to tell you the truth, I don't think that the blackface issue will hurt the Democrats that much. It's not like the Republicans are clean when it comes to racism. Fairfax's problems seem to be more serious, but I bet Northam and especially Herring can write it out. We talked about the new report from NASA and all of the climate change and the Green New Deal and lots of news on that front. KG says, we are not destroying the planet. We are just making it uninhabitable for humans and animals. Mother Earth will prevail, but we might
there may not be anybody on it, right? Yeah.
Exactly. If you have a comment on any topic at any time, you can find us on Twitter @BP Show. Just a reminder that we are on YouTube as well, youtube.com/The Bill Press Show. Subscribe there so you get our videos, and there's a chat room that runs all throughout the program.
All righty. Peter, thank you. So, Congressman, I introduced you as the smartest man in Congress for one particular reason, which is many reasons, of course, but one particular reason, which is you had the good sense not to show up for the State of the Union. Why?
Well, it's turned into a shameful display to give a platform to a serial liar, somebody who willfully shut down the federal government with a tantrum, actually I published what I thought his speech should be.
I read part of it on the air, by the way. Yes.
I just was not going to dignify it with my presence and also to endure it. This is something that I think it may be time to reconsider the ritual that people go through, because it's just a great big photo op, and it has degenerated under Trump. I mean, it was in, I checked the New York Times about 15 minutes into his speech. They'd already identified about a dozen lies that he had said. And this is a speech that has been written extensively, word-crafted, teleprompted, and it still has demonstrable falsehoods. And this is the guy who was picking a fight with his own security team and denying what they said on television and the transcript. I mean, it is just bizarre, and I refuse to participate.
But, I think starting with Ronald Reagan, but Democrats have done it as well, that you're right, that the speech, the State of the Union, which is supposed to be a report to the nation, has devolved into a partisan political rally, right? Tuesday night was a MAGA rally.
It's a infomercial. They have, I would say that the speech is presented by President Obama, Bill Clinton, the interminable, but they were interesting, and there was some substance and some direction.
Right.
But this is just to a new low. Alexandra Petri, who is a pundit in Washington Post on Saturdays, had just eviscerated Trump and the ritual. People ought to Google Petri and the State of the Union. She got it right.
Yeah, I'm interviewing her later this month at the Hill Center right over here on.
Good for you, lucky guy.
No, yeah,
she was just on the show last week, actually, on this past Friday. Yeah, she's great.
She was on my show, and I wasn't.
And you weren't here, buddy. Sorry, sorry.
No, she is great. Very, very lucky to be able to book her at the Hill Center for an event. So the one thing that the president said. We'll let our friend from Shep Smith from Fox News, the one voice of reason on Fox News, believe it or not, in the afternoons, the only time of day there's a voice of reason on Fox News, who pointed out among the many things that Donald Trump got wrong, here is one of them, Congressman.
The president also criticizing ridiculous partisan investigations.
If there is going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation.
That's factually incorrect. Those two things can coexist. And today, the House Intelligence Chairman, Democrat Adam Schiff of California, announced his plans for investigating President Trump.
Right. So the president this morning, of course, or yesterday, he said, Adam Schiff is nothing but a political hack, and this is nothing but presidential harassment. That's what we call it. Right.
Now, the proof will be in the actual work that is done. Already, the witch hunt from Mueller has resulted in numerous guilty pleas and indictments, the web of deceit and probable illegal activity. And Adam is very professional. He's very measured. He's a former prosecutor. And I think it will be something that's going to add to the process. In fact, the president had it exactly wrong. If we don't have accountability at the highest levels in our government and transparency, then it's not going to work.
Well, he basically threatened Democrats not to hold any hearings or not to hold any investigations, which I think yesterday the Speaker and Adam Schiff and others said, well, guess what? We're going to go ahead and do our... You have a certain responsibility under the Constitution.
Article 1 is Article 1 for a reason. Absolutely. And it's interesting, I think, watching what has happened. I think Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leadership, and I will say this large and diverse group of Democrats, including so many new folks, have been focused, and they've been measured, and they've been on measure, not getting distracted by Trump's verbal, words fail in terms of describing it. And his whole shutdown collapsed. He was defeated. I don't think he's going to venture down that rabbit hole again.
Well, I was going to ask you that. I mean, he did not mention the word shutdown during the speech, even though it was his shutdown for 35 days. And this is his speech was delayed because of the shutdown. And his speech takes place in this very short interim between shutdowns. Do you think there will be another shutdown?
I think not. We've had a situation where we watched the increasing discomfort of Republicans who've enabled him. Mitch McConnell, who wouldn't put before the Senate provisions that we passed in the House that had previously been passed by a Republican Senate.
Unanimously.
Yes. And you watched, they lost 6 senators here. There was growing unease in their Republican conference. And it was clear that if he had moved ahead, he would lose more Republicans. They're starting to wake up to the fact that they're going to be held accountable sooner than some of them would like for enabling this reckless behavior. I don't think Republicans really want to do that, and Trump understood that he took a huge hit with the public. I don't know what mechanism he's going to use to claim victory. I don't care what he calls it. But he's not going to get a wall, and I don't think we're going to have a shutdown.
Democrats give no money for the wall.
Well, there's no reason to. This is largely symbolic. Part of what I wrote in my alternative State of the Union is that we have the highest level of border security we've ever had, and there are real things we could do. There are drugs and guns that are coming into the country, but it's at ports of entry. These are things that we ought to have some technological fixes. We ought to have more capacity at these particular pinch points. But to play a game with a wall that won't be built, that shouldn't be built, is a huge distraction.
Now, in addition to investigations and oversight hearings, the Democrats in Congress, on the leadership of Speaker Pelosi, have an agenda of things they want to get done this year. You've got some bills out there I want to talk to you about. We saw one of them introduced. Actually, I think it's actually going to be introduced today. The lead sponsors are Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey, but you're part of that group as well, with this calling a Green New Deal. What's that all about? Why? How important is it?
Well, I think it is important to lay out clearly what the aspirations are. Now,
and by the way, coming on the wake of NASA yesterday telling us we just had the 4 hottest years in history were the last 4 years. So climate change is real.
Well, your home state of California has been devastated by droughts, by fires, unprecedented. The news coming out of this polar vortex, all of these are consistent with what science has been telling us for 2 decades that's going to happen. Right now, the biggest infrastructure program in the United States is disaster relief. We're spending billions of dollars, and it's going to be a losing battle if we continue to increase the carbon pollution. Yes, there are details to be filled in. I'm very comfortable with that. We helped write the agricultural provisions. We need to have a different way of looking at our food and farm policy in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of nutrition, in terms of who we pay to grow what. We continue to pay too much to the wrong people to grow the wrong food in the wrong places. We can reduce carbon emissions. We can have greater water efficiency. And there are resources that we are spending now that are inefficient and enriching the wrong people. The Green New Deal is a statement of where we need to go. We'll fill in a lot of the details. We're going to be doing work on infrastructure, for instance, that will be consistent with that. But I think it's very healthy to be able to lay out a vision that challenges.
Is it realistic, 100% from energy from renewable energy sources and basically getting away from fossil fuels entirely?
It is realistic. The goal is tight, to say the very least. But, Bill, we've watched what we have done with actually minimal government investment compared to what we did winning World War II, what we did getting out of the Depression, what we've done in the past with the moonshot. If we were to employ the same sense of urgency dealing with the transition to renewable fuels, which actually now are getting cheaper. Mm-hmm. It's cheaper to build solar and wind than coal. Were we to do that, that is within our capacity. And in doing so, it would create massive economic opportunity, sources of jobs for people who are watching jobs disappearing in other sectors, and ones that don't hurt the environment, they help it.
Right. One thing that's part of the of the Green New Deal, I was reading this morning, is this, and this has gotten some attention already, quote, a guaranteed job with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family medical leave, paid vacations, and retirement security for every American. A guaranteed job for every American? Not even FDR was able to do that.
Well,
I mean, I love the idea.
Yeah,
I'm getting how
right.
realistic.
Well, as a practical matter, we have opportunities today to put people to work who want jobs. The unfinished agenda, I just mentioned infrastructure. If we did what Ronald Reagan did in 1982 in terms of moving forward to make those sorts of investments, that's a source of hundreds of thousands of family wage jobs. The move to renewable energy will be already has more jobs than coal. You don't get there without having an aggressive goal. We just transferred over $2 trillion based on the Republican tax scam that doesn't pencil out. It enriches people who don't need it and shortchanges people who do. Changing the mindset to invest that money. How many jobs could be created with $2 trillion of unnecessary tax cuts? And that's before we do adjustments in terms of carbon pricing, in terms of in terms of energy. Why don't we actually have market rate leases for giveaways to big oil? Husband the resource, treat it right, change the direction.
Instead of the oil depletion allowance, which we've had for so long. On the agricultural area, again, Congressman, one of the aspects of it that you've been working on for a long time and we've talked about is cannabis. Right. Yes. Now, more and more states have come along. And
47.
With some
form of legalization. 47.
Either medical or recreational.
That's insane,
correct?
man.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
47, right. But how many recreationals? About a dozen so far?
It's I want to say 14 now and increasing.
Right.
We're watching what's going to happen in Illinois and New York. That's probably going to be enacted by the legislature.
As opposed to an initiative, right.
That's right. We had another adult initiative approved in Michigan. And, of course, medical in Utah and Missouri this last election. But 47 states now have some form of state legal cannabis.
So you have legislation coming out fixing federal cannabis policy. Does that mean a national okay for standards for selling or whatever? What do we need to do?
Our approach is to treat cannabis like alcohol. Allow the states to regulate it as they see fit. There ultimately will be a national cannabis tax to help fight the black market, but stay out of the way of what the states are doing. We are proposing that, in fact, there's going to be a hearing next week to eliminate the insane policy of denying legal cannabis businesses access to financial services. And that is teed up and ready to go. We have bipartisan legislation.
The problem where there is that these, so you legalize it, for recreational use, and you have these shops or whatever, and they can't get loans from banks, right, because of federal policy.
Well, they can't get a bank account to pay their checks. There are millions of dollars every month that are spent in paid in taxes with shopping bags full of $20 bills. I mean, it really cripples their
that's
efforts.
Insane.
But there are so many of these little things that we want to fix. Right now, if somebody declares at the border that they use cannabis, they can be denied entry to the United States for life. For life. And this is our northern border as of October 17th. It's legal in the country of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Not just medical, but adult use. And somehow that
technically no Canadian could enter the United States legally if they had ever smoked pot at all.
If they admit it, they can be denied entry for life.
God, that's
and
insane.
for some people, as you know, because California pioneered this in 1996 with medical marijuana, this is, in some cases, being able to control epilepsy. It's what helps with some of the extreme seizure disorders for little babies, where they're just tortured with in some cases hundreds of seizures a day. That we would deny them entry to the United States for medicine that is essential for their health.
And what about the federal law enforcement policy that is marijuana still classified Class 1 drug?
It is a Schedule I controlled substance like heroin and LSD. That the federal policy is no therapeutic value and highly addictive. It's just a lie.
Would you allow the states also from a legal point of view to decide what they want to do? In other words, you can't have the Justice Department sweep into a state where a state is okayed.
Well, we are working now to control federal interference. There is a provision that prohibits the federal government from spending money enforcing prohibition on medical marijuana, and we're going to expand that. But ultimately, we should deschedule marijuana. If we were doing the Controlled Substance Act over again, marijuana wouldn't even be on it, but tobacco would be Schedule I because it's highly addictive and deadly.
Right. Just about a minute left, Congressman. One other issue or item that the President did not mention in the State of the Union is gun safety. Is that a priority for Democrats this year?
Absolutely. And we had candidates across the country embrace it. We had a massive outpouring of support on Capitol Hill yesterday. But candidates were talking sense about gun safety, embracing it, and it turned into, it's no longer, sort of it's a hot button issue to avoid it. People are tired of pretending there's nothing we can do. States that have more robust gun safety laws are safer states, and we're going to have the federal government line up behind it.
Yeah, I think I saw a number where something like 14 members of Congress had a F rating, new members of Congress had an F rating from the NRA and got elected.
I proudly wear my F button.
Have you seen John Yarmouth's?
I've got one.
You've got one, right? He was in. He gave us all an F button too, right? It's good to see you, Congressman. Thanks for being out there in front on so many important issues, fighting the good fight for all of us.
Enjoyed the conversation, Bill.
Congressman, how can people follow you at Rep Blumenauer on Twitter?
That'll do it.
At Rep Blumenauer. You can keep up with us. I mean, he's always shaking things up.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Adam Smith, Eric Kingson, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.